Okay, good evening. Thanks for coming to Fedtalks again. This is Fedtalks number 6, I believe. So, yay. But we're always searching for topics and conversationalists. So if you've got any ideas, maybe at the end over questions and answers or whatever, you can give them to Mike down at the back table there and we'll consider them. Thank you. Our next Fed Talk, we have a little break over the festive season, will be on Monday the 22nd of February, and the topic is what is social justice? It's a big topic, we might narrow it down. We have a couple of great speakers. We've got Professor Baden Offord, who used to live around here but is now based in Perth, and he's the head of the Centre for Human Projects and Education and Human Rights over at Curtin University. So he's coming over here to have a surf and have a talk at Fed Talks. And he'll be in conversation with Kathy Burke, who's a local, who's the CEO of the Hunger Project Australia. So they'll be here on Monday the 22nd of February. Thanks to all the Fed Talk helpers at the back, making coffee and tea and setting up the hall during the night. And thanks to everyone that came to our fundraising dinner last time, where we showed the Edward Snowden film. That has filled up our coffers, so we're going to be around for another year. Yay! Thanks to Bay FM and the Echo for a little bit of help to promote this evening. And tonight's talk is Media, Money and Power. There will be quick Q&A at the end. I always like to remind people that we've got experts here. So maybe you can ask them questions rather than just stand up and tell us about your life. Interesting as it is. Because trust me, we've all heard it. So, welcome to tonight. Welcome to our conversationalists, Colleen Ryan, award-winning writer, and Mark Swivel, soon to be an award-winning writer. And a little plug, you can catch Mark doing his show at the Mullum Music Festival at the Drill Hall at 1 o'clock on Sunday.
1:30.
1:30 on Sunday.
Yeah.
How Deep Is Your Love? So if you haven't seen that, that's worth seeing as well. Okay.
Thanks, Al. And thanks, everyone, for coming. Speaking of broad topics, we thought we'd have a look at media, power and money. We tried to think of a broader topic, but that was as far as we could go. And here we are. I don't know about you, but I feel these days that I live in a kind of media soup. I haven't had a television for around a decade, but I watch a lot of it. I don't read the news on paper, but I'm glued to newspapers online 24/7. You can ask Catherine, my wife. It's a bit of an issue. But this is not a counselling opportunity. And I use social media, as Catherine will also vouch, to connect with everyone, the broader world, to sign petitions, to understand the world around me and to appreciate my abject insignificance within it, which I'm sure is a common feeling. And through all of the change in social media over the last generation, which has accelerated year by year, the only real constants have been Rupert Murdoch and the ABC. One has aged kind of, and the other has died slowly. So the internet promised a radical transformation in the way that we communicate with one another. It was invented by the military and then taken up by hippies and anarchists, although perhaps the followers of Ayn Rand in Silicon Valley got hold of it in the end, and perhaps we'll touch on that on the way through. But what's it all mean? You know, BuzzFeed, New Matilda, HuffPost, all of these new brands. What's clickbait, native content? Where does the ABC, where does Rupert sit within all of that? What of the Arab Spring? What of WikiLeaks? Obama's election, which was when the internet and its or social media and its transformative power was first really cited in the West. What does it all mean? I love the fact that we're discussing these issues here in Federal Hall, which is almost, a black zone as far as our phones go. Here we are in the bubble of the northern rivers, and it's a kind of black bubble within the bubble, where the only advertising you can see is a sign or two down at Federal Store and the constant haranguing we get from Eureka Public School and Eureka Football Club. And that's it. But enough from me, because our guest tonight is the esteemed Colleen Ryan, journalist and author. And I would like you now to confer upon Colleen a welcoming round of applause. Colleen, among many things, is a former editor of the Australian Financial Review, a warrior of the Fairfax newspapers, and the author of a number of books, including the Corporate Cannibals, which we'll get onto shortly, and the rise and fall of Fairfax itself. We're in distinguished company this evening, and we should be grateful, because Colleen is somebody who knows the media from the inside out. Colleen, as some of you will know, is also somebody who had a book pulped because of remarks that she made about a fellow who happens to currently be our Prime Minister. And then some years later, had that very same fellow, that Bondi denizen, launch a later book. How about that? A unique achievement. And so perhaps, because everybody in the world is talking about our Malcolm, perhaps we could begin with your first impressions of the young Malcolm Turnbull, Colleen.
Look, I think everyone's got a Malcolm story, but mine goes back a long way. It's 1978 in the halls of the Supreme Court, and Malcolm was 24, I was 26, and like all 26-year-olds, I thought 24-year-olds knew nothing. And Malcolm was writing for the Bulletin, and he was doing a cover story on Tom Hughes, who was to become his father-in-law. And Tom Hughes, as you all know, is a famous barrister who was up against me on a defamation case. I'd written something nasty about John Laws and Aleko Vrasakis and a property development. And so Malcolm and I found ourselves hanging around in the halls of the Supreme Court a fair bit because I wasn't allowed in while other people were giving evidence. Anyway, Malcolm said to me, God, I've won this Rhodes Scholarship. And Harold Evans, and for those of you who don't know, Harold Evans at that time was the absolute god of global journalism. He was the editor of the Sunday Times. Malcolm says, Harold Evans wants me to work for the Sunday Times as well. I don't know how I'm going to fit it in with all my work at Oxford, and I can remember going home that night and saying to my husband, Steve, that Malcolm Turnbull is so full of shit. Anyway, I got to London a couple of years later as well, and there's Malcolm. He did go to Oxford, as you know, did the Rhodes Scholarship, but I was working for a Middle East publication called 8 Days, which you won't know of because it closed down a few years later. But a lot of the Sunday Times guys like Philip Knightley and Tony Bambridge, Peter Stoddard were all working at 8 Days for 50 quid a day because the Sunday Times had closed down for 12 months. The printers were on strike. And they go along to these union meetings to find out what was happening. And so you've got, the doyens of investigative journalism there. They come back to the office, and if you'll excuse the bad language, they'd say, who the fuck is Malcolm Turnbull? Because I was the only Australian in the office. And apparently young Malcolm, who'd done all of 3 weeks' work at the Sunday Times before it closed down for 12 months, would get up at the end of the union meetings and say to their esteemed gathering, let me summarise for you. And it drove them absolutely insane.
You're just a servant of the people, clearly.
Yeah. Anyway, I came across Malcolm several times again during my journalistic career. I was at the National Times when the Goanna stories were printed, and of course Malcolm was representing Kerry Packer, and he was fairly forceful at that time. And then I was one of the founders of Friends of Fairfax after young Warwick blew the company up and Kerry Packer, Conrad Black and, you know, the wolves were circling to take it over. And we were trying to, you know, media in peril and, you know, keep Kerry Packer off our newspaper, etc. And Malcolm was, of course, very involved as an investment banker in the whole Fairfax imbroglio. And I later wrote a book about it with a guy called Glenn Burge. It's called Corporate Cannibals. And unfortunately, our publisher happened to be the publisher of Spycatcher, which had made that publisher a fortune because Malcolm had gone and won, you know, the Spycatcher case. And the publisher handed Malcolm a draft of our book, and Malcolm took it straight to the Supreme Court and had it pulped. And we had to redo it with 9 footnotes saying Malcolm Turnbull does not agree with this version of events. And it was usually things like there was a meeting of 12 people, we'd interviewed all 12 and 11 had said, oh, it was a shit fight, Malcolm went berserk or whatever, and of course Malcolm said no, it was very calm and I won the argument. But yeah, but anyway, we did make up, and he did launch my book as Minister for Communications, The Rise and Fall of Fairfax, which was very nice of him. But some people at the launch said that they were a little puzzled about who'd actually written the book after Malcolm had given his speech. So he's quite a character.
There we are. And in preparing for our chat this evening, Colleen, you also mentioned that when you were editing the Fin Review, Malcolm was a frequent caller, and presumably he rang just to share his views on the independence of the Fourth Estate, that sort of thing. What did he call about?
Malcolm's very, very litigious. And he's made a lot of money out of newspapers over the years. The Strangled Cat story was one of them. He picked up money twice for that one. You know, Billy McMahon used to be known as Tiberius of the telephone. Paul Keating later took on the title, really, because he would scream down the phone at the slightest little insult. But Malcolm was the worst of all. There was one particular article we ran, which we probably shouldn't have. It was actually a puff piece on Malcolm on page 3, but the author of the article referred to Malcolm as part polymath, part sociopath. And of course, Malcolm objected violently to sociopaths, so I had to sit through a 40-minute conversation while he went through every dictionary definition ever known of the word sociopath. And he later picked up $60,000 from Fairfax to settle it before he took it back to the Supreme Court.
Right. So you've got $60,000 for the best definition, presumably.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, he didn't need money from Fairfax. He's done very well himself, but he did pick up a little bit.
Mm. Yeah, well, talking about Fairfax and its money, I mean, you have a clear view that the rivers of gold that used to underwrite the Fairfax business have really had a profound effect on how the newspaper itself works.
Well, look, I think it's true of the newspaper industry worldwide, and Fairfax had, you know, a lot of the rivers of gold in Australia, but it's a battle for the dollar, which is what's happening to journalism. And it's a very basic explanation. To sell cars, to sell houses, to find jobs, you went to quality newspapers. And the idea was that the quality journalism brought the eyeballs to the newspapers and people would then use them to advertise in. I think newspaper owners were a little bit wrong about that, actually. But when the internet came in, if those advertising dollars had stayed and needed quality journalism, we wouldn't have a problem with quality journalism today, the continuation of it. But we do, because the internet provided an excellent way for people to buy and sell cars, buy and sell real estate and find jobs. None of it was needed. The quality journalism just wasn't needed, you know, and maybe it never was. But what it meant was that the funding went. And I think that the newspaper publishers could have handled the transition to the internet extremely well if they'd still had the dollars behind them, but they don't. The dollars have gone. They've had to slash their staff, slash the amount of money they had available for defamation actions, for sending journalists off for 3 or 4 months to do one story. And I think it's a tragedy. I think that we're really going to lose we're going to lose good journalism. Society doesn't need newspapers, but it needs good journalism. And I think that without the dollars behind it, we're not going to be able to fund it in the long run.
I mean, you were there while that transition happened and the money started to go elsewhere to people like Seek and Domain as they became separate companies, say, at Fairfax. I mean, do you think there was something that the powers that be at Fairfax could have seen coming in that transition?
Well, they certainly should have seen it coming, but they were a very arrogant company, and they're not the only newspaper company that's suffered that way, I have to say. And it's not the only industry that's ever found itself in a death spiral. We've had Eastman Kodak with film, and they should have seen it coming, but they were too arrogant to buy up the young start-up companies at the right time. So it's too late now. Yeah.
Given that, though, I mean, a lot of people would say that despite the shift in the revenue base, the predominant powers in the Australian media in particular, and probably globally, remain dominant. So how do you square that circle?
I think that's still the case, but I think you can argue both sides of that story. One side is that the gatekeepers, the Murdochs, the Packers and the Fairfaxes of the past few decades, their power's definitely diminished. Even Murdoch, we've seen with the Queensland election, Campbell Newman, the Victorian election, the change of leadership, the Murdoch papers were backing the wrong side, so it showed that they didn't have the influence over the voters that they once had. But even today, with Australian news, the Twitterati, the blogs, the radio programs, a lot of the television news, they're still following what the mainstream newspapers are pumping out day by day. And that's a bit sad in a way, because I think what the mainstream newspapers are pumping out is less quality than it used to be. But I do think that'll die over time. And, I don't think we'll have a 7-day Sydney Morning Herald in 3 years' time. And I know that the executives of the Herald are saying that to their own staff.
Sure. So, in the context of all that, I mean, where do you see in Australia the influence of international papers like The Guardian with the Guardian Australia version and also Huffington Post, which is set up? How do you see that changing the landscape here?
I don't think it is changing the landscape yet. I mean, a lot of us in this hall tonight probably do read The Guardian every day, but the journalists we're reading for Australian politics are Lenore Taylor, Catherine Murphy and so forth, that did work for the mainstream media and would still be there if The Guardian hadn't come in and snaffled them up. Sure. The Huffington Post I don't think is making much of an impact. I think it's having an impact on all of our lives, the global the spread of the global giants, the Daily Mail, Vice, New York Times, Huffington Post, The Guardian. I think that is having an impact on all of our reading lives, but I don't think it's having an impact on our coverage of Australian politics and Australian national issues as yet.
Yeah, I've got to say, I found it kind of irritating when The Guardian created their Australia version. I liked the old UK one and used to really enjoy getting hold of The Guardian Weekly. We got any Guardian Weekly old school readers with the tissue paper version? That tactile experience, Yeah. Good. Well, perhaps we can set up a support group afterwards. We could meet here sort of every third Tuesday, get old copies out. Sure. Lovely. So, moving away from newspapers, Colleen, to television in the context of the Australian media. I know you're, an absolute to the boots newspaper person, but people talk about the decline of TV and its inevitable death. But I wonder how you see, television now in the media mix in Australia.
Well, people are watching more television and video content. It's gone up to 17.2 hours a week now. There's not a lot of research on it in Australia. We do know that people are watching a lot more on their mobile devices, but if we look at what's happened in the US, and you compare it with the music industry and the newspaper industry, the revenues of the music industry have dropped 57% in the last decade. The revenues did I say the music industry? The revenues of newspaper industries has dropped 55%. The revenue of the television industry has gone up 250% over the same period. And the reason for that is that television has found a way, through Supreme Court cases in the US, to actually charge YouTube and charge people to replay their content. And so they're charging for little bits, a bit like iTunes with their music, you know, just charging for one song. So I think television is actually going to come out of this transition in much better shape than the newspapers will, or the music industry.
And there's an interesting conversion there too, because you talk about the growing role of video, even within the journalism of print-based journalists, like friends of yours who are talking about how the expectations of their output is changing, so they're not just writing articles. Let
me tell you about that. I'm not working in a newsroom anymore, so and haven't for a couple of years. So I went and did a bit of research, and I spoke to some people that are still, you know, that are working with the Sydney Morning Herald, and they told me that they were called to a meeting about 10 days ago, and there's a new thing at Fairfax called Project Sunrise. And Project Sunrise means essentially digital first. You know, we're not going to have newspapers in 3 years' time. Maybe we'll still have the Saturday Herald, but nothing else. So we have to go digital. And every journalist now has a dashboard on their computer, and once a week, every Monday, they're shown what the top 15 stories they wrote that week were, as long as they wrote at least 15. But, you know, obviously it'd be less if they've written less. How many clicks there were on it, and how long each reader spent on their stories at the average time. Adele Ferguson, who some of you might know her byline, she's the one who broke the story about the Commonwealth Bank financial advisors. She broke the story about the 7-Eleven problem with the underpayment of foreign workers. And the most popular story that Adele has written, and it was a year ago, she said, I turned it around in about 2 hours. It was about Sephora, the cosmetic group, coming to Australia, and how their prices were going to be more expensive in Australia than they are in the US. You know,
scandal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That story still gets 300 or 400 clicks every week. It's still on her top 15, 12 months after she wrote it. And Adele and other journalists like her are under pressure to write stories that get a lot of clicks, clickbait. We don't have news editors in newspapers anymore. There's topic editors. Topic editors are told to look at every journalist's dashboard and to steer journalists towards topics that get the most clicks. And it's just, I think it's a dumbing down. I know, okay, you know, people like mass, you know, you've got to write what people want to read. But on the other hand, you know, what's going to happen to investigative journalism? Adele's view was, look, there will still be investigative journalism, but it has to have mass appeal. So you can't, you know, and there's a lot of stories that have come out over the years that have dribbled out very slowly. I don't know if anyone here remembers the Nugan Bank scandal, but I can remember Marianne Wilkinson working on that for probably 2 years with little bits each week. And then, you know, eventually the whole thing came out that it was CIA-based drug-running organisation with suicides, and, you know, and that. Today, I really don't think that sort of story would get the traction that would allow topic editors to let journalists spend time on it.
Mind you, they did finally track down Michael Hand last week, didn't they?
I know, what's a great story.
Yeah, excellent beard too, nearly as good as the story. Yeah.
And I have to say, there's still some wonderful journalism being done. It's just that I don't think the funding's there for it to keep going.
So, in terms of the clickbait thing, there's a related phenomenon that you're interested in, Colleen, which is it was a term actually that I learnt in our conversations, like native content or native advertising.
This really gets me riled, native advertising. The people that really started it was BuzzFeed. Jonah Peretti started BuzzFeed only in 2006. And he's a guy who had an obsession, and his obsession was what makes people share things through social media. And BuzzFeed, you know, really got us going with cat videos and so forth. But
Thank you, BuzzFeed.
and Jonah Peretti really wasn't a journalist. He's really an advertising and marketing guy, and he's done an amazing job. And he worked out that if you can get people to share on social media, you can exponentially increase the exposure. And that particularly works for people that want to sell products. And so you know about the BuzzFeed lists. Well, a lot of these lists are sponsored by advertisers. One of them, for example, is 25 places that seem not normal but are actually real. And that kind of went viral. The 25th was just said Mini, not normal. And then it was followed by a video of the new Mini minor car. That's one example. Another one is airlines. They'll do the 100 best photos taken out of airline windows, that sort of thing. But BuzzFeed then refined it down to setting up its own little advertising company within BuzzFeed so that they could help advertisers structure their stories and their lists so that they look just like normal editorial BuzzFeed. Now that'd be okay, because that's BuzzFeed. Now, the New York Times has set up its own little advertising agency within the New York Times. The Atlantic Monthly has its own little advertising agency. Onion has its own little advertising agency.
Is that right?
They're called in-house content
A
production
satirical
units.
advertising agency, presume.
Yeah, the Onion, yeah. And so what they do is help advertisers write stories that appear like New York Times stories or like Atlantic Monthly stories. And, okay, they're supposed to have sponsored by somewhere there, but, you know, the inclination is to make that sponsored by as, you know, as discreet as possible. And so there's an enormous amount of revenue now coming into native content. And ad blocking is what really has got it going, because banner ads weren't that attractive, but at least we knew they were advertisers that put them there. But now there's ad blockers. Apparently 200 million people are using ad blockers right now. It's up 41% on last year. And so banner ads are just going to become a thing of the past. And the only way that people can make money is through native content. And how long will it be before we don't know whether we're reading a sponsored story or a real story? A friend of mine was...
Last Thursday. So.
Yeah. A friend of mine was at a tech conference in Austin, Texas. I think it's called South by Southwest. And she says that the managing editor of the New York Times got up and said 80% of their online revenue is native content advertising.
Wow.
And I just think that's a real concern.
So we've reached a point where newspapers have advertising embedded in the product itself.
Yes. We've always had advertorial, but it had to be in a different font. It had to be...
Yeah, and marked accordingly.
Exactly.
And you could refer to private currencies and Illuminati, and if people wanted to, you know, send you a money order, that was okay. Sorry. Anyway,
but
we drift.
I think the concept of the fourth estate's disappearing. You know, the old statement that, you know, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
Yeah.
Afflict the comfortable, I think is completely gone now, because publishers are really having to chase the dollars, which they didn't have to do in the past because they had the luxury of the classified advertising revenue.
And so when you started in journalism, I think one of your editors was Max Walsh.
That's right.
And his attitude to the advertising people within the business was rather different.
Yeah, it was like, piss off, you know, and he would...
It's pretty straightforward, you know where you stand.
Yeah, he would constantly fight with the advertising people. He treated the publisher, who was the guy that was in charge of marketing and advertising, as some lower form of life, you know.
This is at the Fin Review?
Yeah, and there was a constant battle. At the Fin Review, the Sydney Morning Herald, I worked there for 10 years, National Times, I worked for nearly a decade. Constant battle. We don't want any more ads. There's too many ads in the paper, you know. No, you cannot have any more ads. Forget about it. That's all gone. And Peter Smart, who was a veteran journalist in his day, and I remember him saying to me early on in my career, you know what, as soon as the government gets in, it's our job to get them out, you know. And I just think that sort of attitude, that sort of arrogance in a way, it was supported by so much money coming into quality newspapers, and that's completely disappeared now.
Yeah, you'd possibly get a debate on that particular issue. I'm sure a lot of journalists and publications and a lot of politicians would tell you that newspapers, and is that still working, would argue that their job is to get the government out, or at least get the leader changed.
Yes, and it's probably not a good concept to have behind your journalism, I agree, but it was that kind of arrogance, no one can touch us, which has gone now.
Yeah. So during that period, because I'd like some more anecdotes, you dealt with, legends of Australian society and politics, and when you mentioned the National Times, and during that period you took on, such small fry as Neville Wran, Paul Keating, Kerry Packer. And what were those stoushes like?
The National Times did, and those stoushes were huge. We took on Paul Keating over his friendship with Warren Anderson, and that got very, very nasty. There was a fix-it man, I suppose you'd call him. He was a classic person in Sydney called Tim Bristow. He was a standover man.
He was fix-it man's a pretty polite description.
Yeah, and I can remember him once calling me when I was researching a story about Warren Anderson's links with Paul Keating, and he asked me about 4 times in a 3-minute conversation, "You've got 2 children, haven't you? How old are they again? And you live in Bronte, right?" And I was just terrified. And and then of course I was at the National Times at the time, but I wasn't closely involved with the stories. But the furore over Kerry Packer and the Goanna stories, I don't think all that was the National Times printing what the Costigan Royal Commission had said was their unfinished business. But I don't think any newspaper today would be game to take on a Paul Keating or a Warren Anderson or a Kerry Packer on those terms. But Alan Bond was one of my favourites. And I started writing about Alan Bond being a fraudster very early on. And I can remember one meeting with him on the top level of a Sydney CBD building. I was looking out over the harbour. Alan Bond was sitting opposite me. I thought he was going to belt me. He almost had to restrain himself, but he pulled out $8 million worth of advertising from Fairfax. It doesn't sound like a lot these days, but it was huge then, because he had the Tui's Brewery, he had Walton's Bond, he had Hyundai, he had Channel 9, and he pulled all advertising. And the only question I was asked, I was called up to the Chief Executive's office, and all he said was, "Have you got the documents?" And I said, "Yes," and he said, "Fine," and that was the end.
What were the documents, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, the documents were the company searches that showed the way he'd dragged the money out of the public company into his own private company from day one.
Yeah.
It wasn't something he did when he got a bit short, he was doing it from the very beginning. These days, I was talking to one journalist at the Sydney Morning Herald who's written a lot about a very big bank recently, and they threatened to pull all the advertising from Fairfax. They were placated. But from that time on, he had to present to the editor-in-chief every draft of a story, every email he sent to the bank asking questions, to the point where he was made to feel that he was obsessed with the story. Later went on to win, major awards, but it's a very different attitude to advertisers threatening these days.
Do you see? I'm always anxious, Colleen, to look for reasons to be cheerful. Do you see any?
I am a bit down on it.
No. Look, all you're doing is holding a mirror to the world. Let's face it. We've taken a turn, in various parts of the world. Just within the last week, we've taken, turns for the worst. So it's all very well to be flippant and glib, but looking at the media landscape, are there examples of contemporary journalism that you find inspiring? For example, the work of ProPublica.
I do. Look, I think in the US and possibly elsewhere, but certainly in the US, they've been very successful in getting online journalism up. There's Politico, which is actually funded, it's commercial. It's the go-to place for anything on US politics these days. They've got a couple of hundred journalists, top journalists working for them. They've outdone the Washington Post. They're breaking stories all the time, and they're about to set up in Brussels, and they'll have more journalists covering the EU than any other newspaper or even any other country. So that's amazing. And also ProPublica, which is a not-for-profit. It does remarkable investigative journalism. But the US has also got Slate, Salon, Matt Drudge. We don't have those. We've got Crikey, we've got New Matilda, we've got The Conversation, and Inside Story. The latter two are just pretty much academics, and it's given them a wonderful platform. But we don't have, I don't think, good news-breaking investigative online publications, and I think that's because our market's too small. When the dollars are...
You haven't got the dollars to do the sort of long-range investigative work.
I don't think so. I mean, America's got 10 times our population, and so they're obviously going to do a lot better. And I just can't see it happening in Australia. Not yet. Hopefully it will.
Talking about ProPublica, did you hear that story the other day that they ran on the South Vietnamese activists in the US after the war who were trying to overthrow the communist government and were quite active across the US, and there were all of these unsolved murders which the US police let go, and ProPublica did this long-range inquiry.
No, I'll look it up though.
Yeah, it's a fantastic, it's a great example of what you're talking about, the kind of slow burn forensic journalism that you don't see so much of. But actually, on that theme, what do you think of a program like Serial, which was a spin-off from This American Life, which was it was part drama serial, part sort of long-range journalist piece. Did people know what we're talking about? Yeah, it was an investigation that a woman called Sarah, someone help me, Sarah Koenig, thank you, did into a guy called Anand Saeed is currently doing time for a murder, the alleged murder of his ex-girlfriend, and it's like a murder mystery, come crime procedure drama, come serial, and it appeared out of nowhere, and suddenly it was a podcast that everyone around the world was listening to. It's going to be made into a TV series, but as a piece of radio, it's completely compelling, but it's also fascinating from the point of view of how, the convergence of different genres. It's magnificent storytelling, and it's really good journalism too, but it's all folded into this new kind of product, a bit like This American Life itself, which has elements of different forms.
Yeah, look, I think the internet and social media and I will speak positively now, there have been some amazing achievements. We saw it just in Paris over the weekend. Facebook with, I'm the Facebook safety check, I'm safe. There was #OpenDoor where people had put themselves out there and said, anyone who needs shelter can come to my house, my door's open. I think the photograph of that little Syrian boy on the beach in Turkey had a dramatic impact on the way the Europeans saw the mass migration of Syrians. It was incredible, and that was because of social media. And there was an article recently about the migrants coming from Syria and Libya, how they're using social media to be in touch with one another and find out the best routes to go, and they're using their smartphones for that as well, which is quite incredible. And the activists in Syria who are using Facebook to say what's happening in Raqqa, because there's no journalists there, it's too dangerous for any journalist to go there. So that's amazing. And of course the Arab Spring, maybe it shouldn't have happened, I'm not sure, the outcome wasn't that great, but it wouldn't have happened without Twitter, and it wasn't social media's fault that it wasn't successful at the end. But the other side of it is Islamic State using social media to amazing effect. And they're even using cat videos. There's Islamic State of cats and they show jihadists playing with cats, and they get huge number of hits. But, social media is incredible. And you mentioned Obama, Twitter and politics. That happened in Indonesia with Joko recently. Indonesia's got the third largest number of Twitter users in the world. And with India, with Modi, he used Twitter. They've got the fourth largest number of Twitter users. So that was pretty important. And, business, Volkswagen, that was huge on social media, and I'm sure it's had a much bigger impact because of that. CSG.
Just the instantaneous reach.
Yes, yeah. And spreading the word.
Yeah. So, it's interesting you talk about the Islamic State of cats. I wasn't aware of that, and I'm not sure I'll sleep tonight now. But there is a funny dimension to it, I guess. But the points that you make there taken together suggest that you have a technology that's actually politically neutral. So that's the hardware. The question is, what's the software of the politics that you put into that system? You could make an argument that WikiLeaks created a new kind of technology, with the encryption that they use to release all these classified documents. So there's something genuinely new. Poor old Daniel Ellsberg had to, get out the photocopier and do it hardcore, like a first-year university student at Fisher Library. He had to do the hard yards and furtively photocopy not his bum, but the truth about Vietnam. So, and the untenability and how it was of it and how it was unfunded. But then you look at Julian Assange and the achievement of WikiLeaks, and transformative impact for a period to the point that you thought for a while there The Guardian almost didn't exist. It was like an agent of WikiLeaks. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how it seemed for a while. Everything all of their scoops were coming from WikiLeaks. Then, oddly, it stops, right? And then you look at WikiLeaks now and the trajectory of their influence. Like, from a brand recognition point of view, massively well-known, influential. But if you look at the political impact of WikiLeaks, I would query, where it all sits now. Where has that innovation, which has a technological basis and a political motive, where has that left us? I don't know if there's a real answer to that question. I'm just throwing it out there because I can.
Well, I think both Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, the positions they find themselves in, the way they've been slammed so dramatically and so viciously, principally by the US government, but by other governments as well, has probably frightened off a lot of people for the time being from using that technology to do what they did. And I'm a great supporter of what they did. But could I just make one little point? They both use traditional newspapers as well.
Absolutely. The
Guardian, the New York Times, Le Monde and so forth. So that showed, we were speaking earlier about whether the power of the newspapers is going, and certainly the gatekeepers' power is going, but it hasn't gone yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's curious, if you look at journalistic bravery, say, within Australia currently, like there's the Pedergresta case, immense bravery in his career and the choices that he made to go and work for Al Jazeera. Now, cynics might contrast his experience and heroism with Annabel Crabb cozying up to Scott Morrison. Outrageous. For me to mention it, sorry, much loved Annabel. Or Barry Cassidy, the ultimate insider, cozying up on the couch of a Sunday morning. I can't not watch, but I look at it and think, what is this conversation that I find compelling and an important part of my week? What's its actual content? And then you contrast it. It's a kind of crude comparison with
I think the fact it's called The Insiders. Barry Cassidy, a former press guy for Bob Hawke, he is an insider. And Annabel Crabb, that was a fascinating debate about whether kitchen cabinets should be so light and fluffy and so forth. And she batted back very well that, we've got to know how people think. I think we all could have copped kitchen cabinet forever if Scott Morrison hadn't been on. And if you get Scott Morrison sitting opposite you for, probably 2 hours of filming and you don't really nail him on what he's done with detention centres, I think that's pretty bad.
Okay.
Can I also say something? Because you were going to ask me about, I think, Avaz and GetUp and Change.org. My son pointed out to me, which I hadn't realised, that Change.org is actually a multi-million-dollar for-profit organisation that sells email addresses for $1.75 each. And a lot of its petitions are sponsored by special interests. It started out as a not-for-profit, putting donors in touch with causes, but like all corporations, did a couple of takeovers and eventually became this multi-million-dollar organisation. And the Wall Street Journal estimates that Change.org's revenue was $15 million last year, which is pretty amazing. The number of petitions I've signed for Change.org.
That's right. How many people knew this this extraordinary fact? We've got one hand up front. Okay. Suspected. Suspected. Okay. You haven't got your hand up though. Okay. All right. We'll shortly sort of open out to some questions, I think, Colleen. But it's interesting to me to explore the idea to the extent to which social media has actually created new politics. I suppose that's where we're going with WikiLeaks a little, and just looking at sort of developments in, because social justice was part of the theme here too, or one of the questions we were to address. And if you look at progressive political movements around the world, say like Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, they've been particularly analogue and kind of old school in their political content. It's difficult to make an argument that there's been any, and I'm very keen to debate this idea, whether there's been any real innovation in political ideas. And an even more interesting thing I would point to is what's happened with the movements within the leading so-called progressive parties in the US and the UK, where relatively young politicians have been overturned for older political leaders in the form of Jeremy Corbyn and potentially Bernie Sanders. And I think there's something interesting going on there, that there's a struggle with political innovation, and so there's a reversion to people from an earlier time who are more coherent, arguably, and think at least have a vision of social democracy that seems to have fragmented among those who followed them.
Could I just make a couple of points on that? I think Justin Trudeau sort of shoots a few holes in your argument, but
point taken. Apart
from that, I think what you're ignoring is the impact of 2008 and the crisis over the subprime mortgages, which led to this extraordinary austerity campaigns in so many European countries anyway. And I think that's what pushed people more to the left. And some of the old lefties, oldies but goodies, came out of the woodwork. And I think it was more to do with that rather than sort of saying, oh, social media hasn't made an impact there. I think it's a totally different situation. I think it was a reaction to the austerity campaigns following the 2008 financial crisis.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'd also haven't said, and I should, that there's a lot of really good work being done in journalism and in investigations on niche blogs and niche products. I can't sit here and see Giles Parkinson in the audience who's got reneweconomy.com and not say that, because because you're now able to target your audience, there is more of a market for people, for niche publications that are really, focused on particular issues like climate change or renewable energy or whatever. And I think that the internet has made that possible, like wine lovers and golf lovers and so forth have got much more to go to now than they had in the past, and similarly with political issues, because there are niche publications that could not have survived before at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that, and it's a fantastic development. I wonder sometimes, though, not talking about those publications in themselves or avenues of communication and collaboration, but do we live in a time where there's a kind of weird fragmentation, where you end up through social media or through the publications that you prefer, talking to like-minded people, and so you get this that sort of our society ends up as a series of clusters, perhaps more than before, and so the idea that I think I grew up with, where we had newspapers of record, and you could rely on a sort of unpoliticised version of events, and we're all fantasy. Fantasy. Well, that there would have, that there was a sense anyway. Perhaps it's a sentimental fantasy. I don't know that there was more of a sense of if you read the Herald, even the Australian, that the narratives and the agendas were they were clear, but they weren't as overtly politicized, with obvious exceptions.
I think that's true. I think it's certainly deteriorated in the last 2 decades, probably, all happening even before the internet. London's always, I think, had newspapers where, if you were a Tory, you read the Times and the Telegraph, and if you were Labor,
it's much more obvious in the UK.
Much more obvious and much more out there. In Australia, we held on to it for a lot longer, that newspapers and radio stations and television stations had to be objective, but that has changed over the last 2 decades. So you now can see somebody reading the Sydney Morning Herald or reading the Australian, and you've got a bit of an idea of where they might be coming from.
Yeah, and it's the legacy of the ABC to be somehow objective in that context.
Yeah,
the residual obligation.
It is, and one of the great things about not-for-profits like the ABC and the BBC, even though they are being strangled by their political masters in terms of funding, is that they've been able to embrace the internet and so much better than the quality newspapers, because their funding more or less remained the same up until now. They didn't have this, drain of funds, and they didn't have to make as many cuts, and I think, thank God for the ABC and the BBC and those like them. Yeah, and they've really embraced the new technology, and I think done a fantastic job.
Mm. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Both like iPlayer in the UK, which I think was probably the leading technology, and iView here.
Yeah.
They're incredible resources to have online.
They are.
Yeah. So, I mean, where do you see public broadcasting in itself, Colleen? Do you think it's got a limited lifespan, or do you think it'll? Well,
the Murdochs of the world want to kill it completely, and they're having a degree of success, certainly in Britain, with the scaling back in funding of the BBC, and they're trying here as well, arguing that the ABC and the BBC have moved into areas they were never supposed to be in. They're supposed to put out the programs that nobody wants to watch, according to the Murdochs of the world. And so I think they're having a lot of success in trying to strangle it. All the more reason we need to be voting in the Jeremy Corbyns of the world, perhaps.
And, as we approach that fateful day when Mr. Rupert Murdoch is no longer with us, which is not to suggest that I look forward to that day, how do you think the vacuum left behind by Rupert will be filled?
The trouble is, he's created all these people like Roger Ailes of Fox Television, and Rupert will leave a vacuum, but how much impact does he really have at the moment as an individual? I mean, he's got a huge organisation behind him that he's trained to think like Rupert does, and it's been quite successful. So I don't, a lot of people might look forward to the day that we don't have a Rupert Murdoch, but I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference to Fox News or to his publications.
Yeah, well, I'm really lucking out with these reasons to be cheerful. Perhaps we can go to the people for succour and inspiration. I think there's a microphone approaching. Can you say who you are? And there's a fellow there who had his hand halfway up before.
No, I can speak anyway.
We can hear you. You can. Excellent projection.
I want to know about the role of radio in Australia, because it has been subject to a lot of personality clashes, obviously, Alan Jones and the like. So I was wondering your thoughts on radio and the history of radio in Australia, and where can we see it going? Is it going to be a medium from which we can see more progressive change, potentially?
Well, radio is actually doing quite well in terms of revenues in this transitional phase. It's probably doing even better than television. It's talkback radio is incredibly popular. I mean, once I discovered Pandora and iTunes radio and so forth, I thought, oh, that's the end of radio stations. But talkback radio, breakfast shows, they're all doing extremely well. I think you're probably referring to the, the Alan Joneses of the world. Yes, they'll die out, but we've got the Ben Fordhams coming through and, the younger generation. And even though Alan Jones's audience might be 110 in the shade, there's, a younger audience following people like Ben Fordham. So I think there'll always be a really good market for talkback radio. I don't think you're going to see the end of it anytime soon. And it gets good revenue.
People spend more time in the car.
They do. Yeah.
At the same time,
Yeah.
you'd have to include the wonderful world of podcasting as an adjunct to radio these days. And there's a massive multiplicity of voices around the world in that forum. And I don't, it's over to you guys to provide the reasons to be cheerful, but I'll have a crack. That's one of them. I mean, it's fantastic. And there are podcasts for every political taste if we're talking about podcasts.
And smartphones have really made radio work too, because you've always got the radio with you. You just turn your smartphone on and, you can listen to the radio. So it's
literally
tremendous.
true. Like all day today. I
Yeah.
looked at vox.com. I watched a 5-minute video on the background to the war in Syria, back to the cricket, then back to, and so on. That's how you live these days. Yes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
I'm an ABC tragic. The president of the Northern Rivers Friends of ABC, everybody please join. And
Membership forms at the front desk.
yeah, what I wanted to ask you about was something else. I'm always pleased to get the Saturday paper every Saturday. Any comments?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Maury Schwartz, who you're talking about the Saturday paper, aren't
Yes,
you? Yeah. I think he's a tremendous philanthropist, really, because I can't see that he'd be making much money out of it. But, he's got the monthly and the Australian Quarterly as well, and they're tremendous additions to print media in Australia. He reminds me a little bit of Gordon Barton back in the 60s and 70s when he launched, Nation Review and so forth. And I wish we had more philanthropists like that. We did for a little while with Graham Wood, who funded the Global Mail, but unfortunately that folded. But he's also putting money behind The Guardian in Australia. But it would be great to see more come forward.
Is that the What If guy? Yeah?
Graham Wood was What If,
What
yes.
If, yeah.
And he married Andrew Wally's widow, which may be why he's got a bit of a passion for journalism.
Okay.
Colleen, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the teaching of journalism, which it sometimes seems to me there's more teachers of journalism than journalists almost. But
I was never a big fan of journalism courses. When I was editing the Financial Review and we would, put on, half a dozen trainees every year, I always tried to avoid graduates of journalism schools. And I think I was wrong, because I now see that some of the best journalists of the generation behind me, or a couple of generations behind, have come out of journalism schools. What I do think is cruel is that they're continuing to pump out hundreds and hundreds of graduates each year, and they're not, and there's no jobs. There's none at all, or there's very few, there's a handful in Australia. And I just think that's really bad, because it's actually quite hard to get into a journalism course. You've got to have a really good UAI or whatever they call it these days. And I just think they should be pushing the kids towards something else. Plumbing, law, economics, something that it's a bit broader, you know, where they could actually get a decent salary packet at the end of the day when they have to pay to raise their children.
More questions?
Yeah, I was wondering whether you would agree with me that this concentration of money that doesn't go to good, honest journalism or public broadcasting has to do with the deregulation of trade and finance, these series of trade treaties that have given the giant multinationals more and more power, and that's leading to ever more commercialization. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't think it does have a big impact, because not many journalistic vehicles are owned by huge multinationals, apart from Murdoch, I suppose, that I'm aware of. I think that the news industry can be just as grubby and commercial as anywhere else, and I'm not sure that trade treaties would have any impact on it, not that I'm aware of anyway. We haven't been able to read about the Trans-Pacific Partnership until quite recently, and I haven't actually got my head around it because they kept it quiet for so long. But no, I don't think it would have an impact, in my view.
Well, that's an interesting example in itself, though, Colleen, isn't it? Like, even on the ABC, I noticed that politicians on both sides of the spectrum were able to say that the TPP was subject to, you know, secrecy provisions without being challenged by the journalist who was interviewing them. And I thought that was a really bloody dreadful
Oh,
thing.
I agree.
You know,
Couldn't believe it. Okay, you can't change it once it's been signed, but why not have a debate before it's signed?
yeah, I mean, like, if you talk to friends, colleagues, like, still at the coalface about those sorts of issues, because there's a kind of compliant approach that, you know, is really disgraceful.
You can bet we got done over by the Americans too. They're so much better at trade negotiation than we are.
Well, there's a slight difference in bargaining power the last time I checked the stats.
My name's Sandy Gilmore, and I used to devour lots of newspapers. These days I only read the odd Financial Review when I'm passing through an airport. But it's occurred to me over my lifetime that possibly as information speeded up and its availability has speeded up, that's narrowed journalist perspectives in terms of a century ago, when politicians travelled between Sydney and Melbourne and Canberra on steam engines, and information travelled by snail mail at best, that the journalists then had a lot of time to think about things, and we had bigger, more researched articles that dealt with the ideologies and the views and the empirical evidence of what different politicians are reporting on had done. And this sort of thing doesn't happen today, where basically everyone knows everything from 24 hours ago, and they're dealing with what's happened in the past 24 hours. Just wondering if you've got any opinions on that.
I think you're absolutely right about that. You know, and because they're trying to keep the 24-hour news cycle, you're always looking for a fresh lead, if you like. So the tiniest little, you know, advance in the news becomes the first paragraph, which is really takes the whole context away. But when you look at what the journalists have to do as well, you can see what's happening. With Project Sunrise at Fairfax, they've all got to do a video with every story now, because videos attract ads. And how do you get the time to do that? And I was talking to Kate McClymont recently, and when she was covering ICAC, she had to go out of the room and send, you know, online stories like every hour, and she'd miss things while she was out of the room. And then you get something wrong at the end of the day because you've missed a crucial piece of evidence. But if you're sending hourly stories, it's really hard to gel a good argument in your brain and, you know, let it sort of fester. I think it's changed dramatically, and I think it was changing well before the internet, actually. I recently got hold, thanks to my cousin Anne, who happens to be here tonight, recently got hold of a 1949 edition of the Wagga Daily Advertiser. And Anne had this because her mother had kept the edition because her wedding photo was in it. But Anne thought I'd be interested because I spent 6 years in Shanghai covering China, and on the front page of this Wagga Daily Advertiser was the communists reached Shanghai, which was quite amazing. But then I read the whole paper, and it was like reading a very good, New York Times. It was very sophisticated journalism. The lead story was about the Commonwealth Bank, which was then the Reserve Bank, and what they were doing with their economic or their interest rates and so forth, but in a really sophisticated way that you probably wouldn't even see in the Financial Review these days. And similarly, the coverage of Chinese politics. And I thought, God, we've really deteriorated. We like to think we're evolving, but we're going backwards at a rate of knots. And there's a much more casual and opinionated form of journalism creeping just into news stories that would never have been there 50 years ago, 20 years ago.
Does it have anything to do with the attitude towards the punters in the media itself, or where does that come from?
I think there's such a dash for dollars that you're going for mass market all the time. So I think that's where it's coming from.
Just a quick thought on Sandy's idea about time. I remember when Barry Jones wrote Sleeper's Wake, which some of you will remember, which was about the coming technological revolution and how we would have so much leisure time. And the great social challenge would be how to spend that social time that we would have. And it's interesting in the generation since then what's actually happened and how technology has expanded to fill all of the time available, and people feel this extraordinary compression of their lives and this constant stress. And that in itself, I think, for if you're interested in my ideas, is one of the primary sources of political repression in social democracies. The sheer lack of time that people have or perceive that they have to then actually do anything about the social context that they find themselves in and may wish to resist or change. And you also then end up, by dint of the same forces, with these incredibly constricted constructions or framings of political ideas. And that's where we end up with border control equals stop the boats. Why do we have to stop the boats? Because of deaths by sea, which is not the algorithm, which is not like an algorithm which is driving our life generally, the world of algorithms. It's simple algebra. And so we live a political life of simple algebra, which is actually killing us because it's... And Colleen's story about the Wagga Advertiser in 1949 just demonstrates that point.
Mm. Yeah, what you're saying, it's not just greed and consumerism. To actually keep a roof over your head and keep the meal on the table, you need to work harder.
Just following up on the Wagga Advertiser, I'm from Adelaide Advertiser territory, and exactly the same, I came across the exact same experience. My mother was, I don't know how she did it, but she collected newspapers of the days that we were born. I'm 1946, so it was immediate post-war Adelaide Advertiser, and it was incredible. When she showed it to me, I couldn't believe it. It was really in-depth reporting about post-war Europe, at a level that, as you've said about the Wagga paper, I mean, it was something that you would have only got in a New York Times sort of level, and this was, the Adelaide Advertiser. So I think that just supports what you were saying about the Wagga paper. It doesn't bear any resemblance to the Adelaide Advertiser today. That was not my question. My question is, how do we... The ABC, it's under a lot of pressure at the moment because it's perceived to be something for the likes of this audience in this room. I'm sure we all appreciate the ABC and the sort of the quality of what it produces, but we represent a very, how to put this, there is a big Australia out there that would not appreciate the sort of things that come on the ABC as we do. And it's the ABC, being a public broadcaster and is being funded by all of Australians, how do they overcome this quandary? How do they become an organ for all of Australians but still produce quality material?
I don't know.
I want my money back.
I don't want them to change.
Come on, Colleen. You can do better than that.
Well, I don't think they can. I think there was a great, this is going off topic a tiny bit, but there's a fabulous DVD, 50 Years of the BBC. And it's wonderful because it's got all these news clips and it takes you right back through history of, you know, London pea soup fogs in 1963 and so forth. But one thing it did show was that when television was first introduced, BBC newsreaders had to be terribly careful not to show any expression on their face at all in case it was seen to be subjective, you know, and to affect the objectivity of the BBC. And I know the BBC's changed dramatically since, but what I'd like to see the ABC stay as is try and be as objective as possible and try and, you know, have that old ABC and old BBC culture. But if the ABC went mass market, Rupert Murdoch would even more try to kill it. But I think it would destroy a lot of what we need it for culture, for good news and good current affairs. So I think it's really hard.
What effect do you think mass surveillance of the internet will have on what gets published and what publications get read?
Yeah, I think it'll have a dramatic effect because it'll lead to second guessing. I saw a program quite recently about a woman that was under constant surveillance because they, you know, thought that she was affecting national security. She was an ex-MI5 operative. And she said, don't for a minute think that, oh, I've got nothing to hide, surveillance doesn't matter to me. She said the way you, having been under constant surveillance, the way it completely changed the way she lived her life and what she did and who she spoke to, and all her activities were impacted by this. And I think once we become more and more aware of the surveillance of the internet, I think that will affect our communications across it as well. But at the moment, many people seem to be quite happily ignoring it.
Hey, I just wanted to ask, about the attacks on the ABC and what kind of trajectory you're looking at for a relation to the media and the relationship to the government, because it seems like it is changing. I mean, you were saying, you spoke briefly about that before, but what relationship can we expect to see in the future going into where it's okay to actually attack someone like the ABC? And was it merited, the attacks by the Abbott government?
No, I don't think they were merited. Unfortunately, I found myself in the position of agreeing to do an audit of the ABC's federal budget coverage of 2014. I don't know if you remember, but I made the mistake of criticising Lee Sales for being rude to Joe Hockey. No, Sarah Ferguson, sorry, for being rude to Joe Hockey, and it sent the Twitterati into absolute meltdown. But I don't, you know, the bottom line of my audit was that it was incredibly fair and incredibly balanced, and so I don't think the attacks are warranted. What's really interested me about my old friend Malcolm Turnbull being Prime Minister now is it's amazing how the culture comes down from the top, and I think his views on the ABC, while they might not quite match yours, will be a lot more enlightened than Tony Abbott's, and I think that these attacks on the ABC will actually stop. I mean, there was a lot about the Abbott government that was really unpalatable, and that was one of them. And I think now that we don't have that person at the top, that the culture coming down will change, and I think the attacks on the ABC will dissipate a lot.
Do we have any more questions out there? Steve?
I don't want to be superficial, but could you just take us back to the strangling of the cat?
Well, this was an item in the National Times, about 1982 or 83, and Malcolm will probably sue me for even repeating it, but Diamond Jim McClellan, was quite a colourful politician in Australia, and his stepdaughter was one of Malcolm's former girlfriends before Malcolm, took up with Lucy. And this girl had claimed to Richard Ackland, who some of you might know, he now writes the gossip column in the Saturday paper, claimed to Richard Ackland that she tried to break up with Malcolm and he was very upset about it, and he strangled her cat. And then he wrote letters to the dead cat saying, anyway.
Sorry, so Malcolm...
No, no one's saying this is true.
Of course not. Of course not. No one in this room, anyway.
No.
So Malcolm allegedly strangled a cat, and then I just want to check this, because fact checking is important. Right?
Yes.
That he then wrote letters
to the dead cat.
To the dead cat,
right.
A cat that was dead.
Yeah.
Very good.
So Richard wrote about it in the Clancy column, and Malcolm sued, and I can remember
the cat.
Malcolm sued the National Times, and I can remember Adrian Deemer, who was a former editor of The Australian, then went and did law and became our guru defamation lawyer at Fairfax, and he'd be in the office nearly every day. Richard, have you got the letter yet? No, she said she's cleaning out a garage and she'll find it on the weekend. This went on for months and months, and of course there was no letter to the dead cat. Well, certainly she never handed it over. But I noticed that Richard put it... Anyway, Malcolm got a lot of money out of that, but... and Richard actually put a little bit in his gossip column in the Saturday paper last Saturday about it, and he quoted, I think it was Neil McPhee, who was the barrister that it was brought in for the mediation for Fairfax, who walked out of the room and said, I don't even know if there was a fucking cat, settle it, But I left the National Times and joined the Sydney Morning Herald, and I was in the business section, and Mark Westville was writing the CBD column. And he was writing something about Malcolm trying to stand for pre-selection for North Sydney, so I was going back a while. And I said, the cat strangler. He put a reference to it in his column. He said that the RSPCA in North Sydney would be very interested in their new member. And Malcolm picked up more money. I think he picked up $90,000 this time. So that's the cat story. But apparently in the latest, in the latest biography of Malcolm Turnbull by Paddy Manning, Paddy decides the cat story is not right because people told him it's really hard to strangle a cat. And
having attempted it many times.
Trevor Kennedy, who was Malcolm's editor at the time at the Bulletin, said that he'd never seen Malcolm upset or even talk about cats. So so that was the cat story.
I've just received a text from a lawyer. Bit late for them to be working. Also another one from someone claiming to represent the ISIS world of strangled cats. Surely that's the internet
Islamic
working
State
too
of
quick.
cats, yeah. Two things. The rural and regional papers took a lot longer to suffer the advertising drain because they were still using classified ads to sell their cars and houses, but eventually, of course, realestate.com and Seek and everywhere went into rural and regional Australia, so that's really suffered. It is true that the internet is international and national, and certainly if you've got anything Australian on the internet, people are going to go for national advertisers because that's where the big dollars are, and regional news really does suffer. I think the big winners out of the whole shift to the internet are going to be the big global players like the New York Times, The Economist, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. And I think the biggest sufferers will be the rural and regional newspapers. And I'll just make one point. In Texas, this happened. A lot of the newspapers closed down and the Texas State House was hardly being covered at all. And so they set up something called the Texas Tribune, which is an online publication. And apparently is a very good publication, but it's funded by all the oil companies and the local techs and businessmen. So you wonder what their business coverage is like. But apparently their state political coverage is improved in leaps and bounds, but it's kind of semi-philanthropic supported. And we might find that sort of thing. I think we'll also find a lot of native content in rural and regional online publications. It'll be inevitable. It's the only way they'll make money. I'm a different demographic to you. I do know about Vice, and I do know that they've got an Australian version, just as The Guardian and Daily Mail and HuffPost have an Australian version. And my son, who's more your demographic, tells me it's terrific and sometimes sends me articles from Vice, but I'm sorry, I'm not informed enough. While I love using the internet, I tend to go for the traditional mastheads still. Yeah, I'm just an old traditionalist, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite edgy and serious, Vice. I mean, I don't go there too often, but yeah, it's a critical voice, and it's interesting to see that Murdoch is. I didn't know that. Getting a stake in it, because your point would be how sustainable is that critical voice when the money comes in.
It's like The Onion. Where did that come from? But
oh, that's just funny.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
Over the name, I mean.
Yeah.
And over recent years, I've become very interested in the monetary system, and I'm appalled at the total lack of ignorance which seems to be shown by many commentators and media people as to how the monetary system works. It seems to be totally accepted that the federal budget is like a household budget, which is totally untrue because the federal government can create money. It's not the same. The states may well be like household budgets, but the federal budget isn't. And constantly, even on the ABC, the interviewer will say, "Well, where's the money coming from?" without having the slightest idea of how money is created and what the function of money in society is. It seems to me that the politicians get away with murder because of the total lack of understanding in the populace of what money is, and that this is amplified
I think
by
that's
commentators'
true.
ignorance.
I think even one of the arguments I made when I did the ABC audit of their federal budget coverage was it was all the political journalists that were assessing the budget. They've actually got some really good business journalists and economics journalists like Ian Verinder and Alan Kohler, and they weren't even on the 7:30 report or the news on the night of the federal budget. It's almost impossible to imagine the BBC would cover a British budget without their economics correspondent having the lead role. And I think we do that. We have, too much political analysis and not enough economic and intellectual grunt behind the coverage. Even in the quality newspapers, even in the Financial Review, the economics writers are kind of on the left-hand page, halfway up the back of the paper, and it's the political journalists that are analysing the monetary policy and the budget. And so I just think it's wrong. I don't know. Maybe it's the Canberra Press Gallery have somehow or other got too much power. But I can see what you mean too, and sometimes we can expect too much of journalists as well, with their knowledge of, I'm sure your knowledge of the monetary system would be, far beyond any journalist capacity. But one of the problems is we're always looking at the politics of it instead of the economics and the nuts and bolts. It is concerning. Part of the issue is that a lot of people are watching television and movies and things on the internet. When I was talking about the television industry earlier, the number of hours we spend watching video and television content has gone up to 17.2 hours a week. 11 hours a day is a lot. I don't know if I believe that statistic. Well, that would be work as well, I guess. Yeah. And Yeah.
Well, we should all buy a copy of New Philosopher this month anyway.
Yes.
Check it out. Check those footnotes.
I think another example of that was Julia Gillard's Misogyny speech. The Canberra Press Gallery thought it was pretty ordinary, but it went viral on the internet and was probably one of the most powerful, important speeches she gave in her entire career as PM. It is power to the people, and that's a really positive aspect of it.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks, Suzanne. Great note to end on. Can we first of all thank Alan Goldstein, who works so tirelessly to make these things happen. And make sure everyone comes back and brings a friend and a plate, if you like, for the next Fedtalks, when Kathy Burke, who's great from the Hunger Project, is talking with
Baden Offord from Curtin University.
Okay.
On the 22nd of February.
22nd of February. Okay.
Social justice.
Social justice. And thanks very much for coming out on a school night, everyone. Thanks, Alan, for asking me to be involved. It's been a great privilege, seriously, Colleen, to spend time with you and put this together and do it. And I think we should give Colleen a really warm round of applause to express our appreciation.
Thanks very much.
Because it's worth saying that it's great to hear the fourth estate embodied in somebody like Colleen, because things like the fourth estate, the tradition of independence in journalism, is merely an idea that only becomes a social or political fact thanks to the commitment and strength of the people who live it. So that's why the appreciation is very real. So thanks, Colleen.
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Ellen.
And thank you too to Mark, and again, Colleen, thank you very much. They put lots of cup of coffee goes into these little chats, so thank you.